Alright, welcome to the next Cerebellum lecture. Sorry it's been a while. So, the Cerebellar peduncles is the first thing we're going to talk about here. Now, the peduncles, if you don't know, there are three: superior, middle, and inferior. And these peduncles, peduncle, like going for a pedicure, it means foot. So the peduncles are the connection between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Superior, middle, and inferior. So the superior one has a few different constituents. This incredibly long-winded name that actually tells you what it does. So the dentato-rubro-thalamic pathway, the DRT. So the dentato from the dentate nucleus, going to the rubro, the red nucleus, and then onwards to the thalamus. So the dentato projects to the thalamus and gives off collaterals to the red nucleus. Now, this dentate projection decussates, crosses over at the level of the inferior colliculus, and this axonal decussation to the other side is the vermikinks crossing over, so it has an eponymous name. Sends those collaterals to the red nucleus, runs via the thalamus to BA 4 and 6. It looks a little bit like this. So from your dentate nucleus, coming up through the superior cerebellar peduncle, decussating at the level of the inferior colliculus, running to the ventrolateral thalamus, and then onwards to BA4 and 6 there. This is what it looks like. So the superior cerebellar peduncle connects the midbrain to the cerebellum, the middle cerebellar peduncle, the cerebellum to the pons, and then the inferior one, the cerebellum to the medulla. So you can clearly see on this beautiful imaging here an upward slant, a superior slant as it's going from here to the midbrain, decussation at the inferior colliculus, and then onwards. But there are a couple more that you need to know. So your ventrospinal cerebellar tract is actually coming in, it's not going out, and it's the one that double crosses, which we've talked about before. There are also vestibular afferents. Okay, so from the cerebellum to the vestibular region, and this is the flocculonodular lobe. So it's the vestibular region, so it's the flocculonodular lobe, which is the vestibulocerebellum. So that should be no surprise. And that has an important role in the regulation of the medial longitudinal fasciculus, so keeping your extraocular eye movements moving together. And then the tectocerebellar, tecto, like the tectum of the midbrain, so that we know because the superior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. So tectocerebellar afferents. So you can see that the trend here, with the exception of the dentato-rubro-thalamic pathway, is that the superior cerebellar peduncle modulates inputs coming in, but the dentato-rubro-thalamic is an important output. Okay, so the tectocerebellar epithalamus to coordinate audiovisual reflexes. Go back and remind yourself what the epithalamus is versus the metathalamus versus the thalamus and the subthalamus. So, our middle cerebellar peduncle, this contains corticopontocerebellar fibers, so fibers that come all the way from the top, from the cerebral cortex. They run down. They come to the front of the pons, or the basal pons, because that's where the basilar artery sits. They synapse in the pontine nuclei, and then they cross over. So ipsilateral corticopontine, and then contralateral pontocerebellar. So there is a decussation that occurs at the midpoint of these fibers. Okay? And these crossing fibers in the pons are those such things. So, inferior cerepeduncles now, these mostly contain ascending tracts, for example, from the spinal cord. So that's dorsospinal cerebellar and cuneo-cerebellar tracts, which we should know about. They're connecting the muscle spindles. And then the VOR, so this is not the vestibulocular reflex, but this is one way to remember it, the vestibulocerebellum, the olivocerebellum, and the reticulocerebellum. So connections from those four vestibular nuclei, from the olivary nucleus, and from the reticular formation. Okay, so let's take them all in turn. So the vestibulocerebellar tract is from the ipsilateral inner ear, through the four nucleuses, and then the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The olivocerebellar tract is from the olivary nucleus, and the internal arcuate fasciculus, which is the decussation point. This is where they cross over. They cross over with the medial lemniscus fibers and the medulla, and then they run through the contralateral ICP as the climbing fibers. The reticulospinal tract is the origin of the mossy fibers. So revise the climbing and mossy fibers that you saw as the two afferents into the cerebellum that modulate those cerebellar cortex fibers. You've got your climbing fibers, you've got your mossy fibers. The climbing fibers regulate the and Purkinje cells. The mossy fibres have that packed with the Golgi type 2 and the granular cells. They form that glomerulus that is surrounded by the neuroglia. If you're not happy with that, go back and watch that first cerebellum lecture, because there's obviously spiral curriculum, so they're building on each other. So, just redoubling down on some pathways you need to know. The Cerebroolivocerebellar pathway and the Cerebroretikulocerebellar pathway. Now, this pathway is from the cortex, going through the corona radiata and the internal capsule. It bifurcates to both inferior olivary nuclei, and then forms, therefore, this olivocerebellar tract, the climbing fibres, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. It will control as its climbing fibres, climbs around the dendrites of the Purkinje cell, and it's powerfully glutamatergic, so it's really excitatory to control that Purkinje output. But the cerebroreticulocerebellar formation, similar route out of the cortex, corona radiata, internal capsule, it will go to the pontomedullary reticular formation bilaterally. So these are both bilateral fibres, and then form the mossy fibres and go through the middle and inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay? And remember that we said the mossy fibres correlate to that glomerular structure. Okay? Corticopontocerebellar, corticoreticular, and cortico-olivary. 3 pathways that are keenly linked together that we have covered. So remember the levels in which they go into things. Corticopontocerebellar is middle cerebellar peduncles. These 2 are inferior cerebellar peduncles with 1 or 2 exceptions. So just make sure that you're happy with those constituents. So, cerebellar afferents from the vestibular nerve. So, the anatomy of the vestibulocerebellum. Okay, so we have a vestibular apparatus through the same-sided middle and inferior vestibular nuclei through the ICP. And this is the coordinator of postural adjustments. So this is, there's not really much to say about here. It's ipsilateral, so you don't need to worry about decussation. It comes in through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. It comes from 2 nuclei in particular, and it helps the coordination of posterior movements. This is the input into that vestibular cerebellum that we talked about. So we're going to talk about the Globose-embeliform-rubro pathway now, and this is the interposed nuclei of those deep cerebellum nuclei. So remember, you've got your dentate, your globose, your embelliform, and your fastigial nucleus. So this pathway, those 2 interposed nuclei that we talked about, the embelliform and the globose, and this is what they look like if you're interested. Here's your globose, here's your embelliform. Here's your globose, here's your embelliform nuclei here. So there's the interposed nuclei. So they run out through the superior cerebellar peduncle, where they will decussate and hit the rubrospinal tract. So this is basically, it's the origin of this rubrospinal tract, which we talked about, which is the flexotonic levels, right? So the rubrospinal tract is involved in flexotone, which will be your gravity muscles, so flexing, bending down with gravity, but your anti-gravity postural muscles is a lateral vestibulospinal tract, okay? But the origin of the red gravity with muscles is this embelliform-rubro pathway. Okay, so the Globose-embelliform-rubro pathway forms the rubrospinal tract. Now, functions of the archi, paleo, and neocerebellum. So, the archicerebellum is our old phylogenetically speaking region of the cerebellum. It has the flocculonodular lobe. Paleocerebellum is sort of mid-level, which is also the spinal cerebellum. So we have the vermis and the paravermis. And then we have our lateral hemispheres here bilaterally. So, archicerebellum, vestibular cerebellum, paleo, spinocerebellum, neocerebrocerebellar. Go back to the lecture where we talked about those functions, but, again, as we said, that the neuroscientists quite happily name these things for their functions. So, balance and coordination, spinocerebellum, posture, and cerebrocerebellum, the more complex plan motor skills, right? And learning. Learning is important. So there's a whole host of different things that are mentioned here. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'm going to give you some links if you want to. So, ataxia. The visual symptoms from disturbed ocular motor control in cerebellar patients are often extremely disabling and life-altering. For example, double vision due to ocular misalignment. This is a huge thing, okay? So you have ocular double vision, or you have oscillations from the ocular regions because of nystagmus. So remember how we talk about how there is key links to the medial longitudinal vesiculus and fine motor movements and the coordination of balance and tone and things, a whole function of pathways that connect regulation to a vestibular apparatus and regulation to the cortical and brainstem controls of eye movements are a potential neurological minefield for ataxia and visual issues. So it's worth bearing in mind as you're studying these things, there is a reason why we're studying all of these granular things, because the input and output into the cerebellum, this often overlooked part of neuroanatomy, can have really profound effects on patients. Really profound effects. They're often extremely disabling and life altering. The TLDR of that, too long didn't read, is that the floccular nodular lobe, right? So that archi cerebellum, the vestibular regulation and control of the vestibulo-ocular reflex. So if you can't keep your eyes focused on a fixation target when you're moving your head around, such as when you're walking and you're bobbing up and down, if your eyesight, if your whole visual field bobs up and down, it's very disabling to do any movement. Meanwhile, the vermis will saccade to the target, right? So saccades are little jumps, so it's how your eye quickly darts. If I say look over there and you keep your head still and your eyes dart, that's a saccade. It moves to the target. But if you have dysmetria, if you have some sort of past pointing going on, you will have dysmetria of eyes as well. So you will look at my finger over there, you'll look, but you'll miss, and it will take one or two corrective efforts. That's the vermis failing you, okay? A downbeat nystagmus, where you drift up and then zip back down, and remember the nystagmus is always named for the saccadic portion, the zip, not the correction, is vestibulocerebellar compromise. Okay, so these are three key regions to know about, basically. If you're more interested in this, this is a really good article from 2009 in Brain, and it's free, it's open access, so you can have a read about it. It's a bit long, so I'm not really included much more than those 3 points, but that's basically what you need to know. So there you are, thank you very much. That is another lecture done.